p.m. I'd also like to ask as a courtesy to all, please ensure that you have silenced your cell phones. Each director received notice of this committee meeting. The public meeting notice was properly posted as required by law. All committee members indicated that they would be present for this meeting, with the exception of Director Tracy LaChance, who is absent for personal reasons. At this point in the meeting, we have set aside time to hear from you, the general public. Those of you that were interested in providing comments and filled out one of the cards available at the receptionist desk would be called for comment at this time. Seeing that no one wishes to speak, we'll move forward on the agenda. First item on the agenda is a report and possible discussion on Possum Kingdom Airport property update by Mr. Mike McClendon, Upper Basin Regional Manager.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you. I'm going to provide an update to you, as you said, on the Possum Kingdom Airport. The intent of the presentation, well, I guess there'll be no action requested from the board from this presentation. It's really just kind of an update, but I'll get to that at the end and talk a little bit about where we've been, where we're wanting to go, and then get some feedback from the board to make sure that's the right direction. So the airport was constructed in 1980, if you recall, through a TxDOT aviation grant. Some of the airport amenities there are a pilot's lounge, there's a runway, a hangar, and then there's also a parking area. Over time, the Brazos River Authority has obtained some additional grant funding from the state, which is TxDOT Aviation, for maintenance and upkeep of the runway, the apron, the lighting, etc. Had going back since July through January, we've met monthly with TxDOT Aviation and the Brazos River Authority. Attending those meetings on occasion would be the FAA. I think they showed up to one meeting. And then we've kept the county apprised. They haven't attended any of those meetings, but I've been in contact with the county judge and kind of let them know where we've been to date. So I've been keeping the county advised of where we're at this point. There's been two primary issues that have revolved around our discussions. One of those is claims by the FAA that there's continued federal obligations of the Brazos River Authority. And those obligations are really associated with like mandates, authorizations, or directives, or securities. And so one of the other components of that they're, I guess, contending is that the BRA should be held as a financial security if we were to convey the airport to the county. And so that was kind of a non-starter. If the county defaulted on a, $1, $2, $3 million loan, we didn't want the Brazos River Authority to be held responsible. So that's been an issue. The other issue I mentioned was the federal obligations. We went to the FAA and TxDOT Aviation and showed them in writing where there were no federal obligations, and they actually admit that it's an old grant document from 1980, but they weren't willing to, I guess, accept that. And they continue to say we still had federal obligations. So we scheduled another meeting with the FAA and TxDOT Aviation, and FAA didn't show up. A lot of times through previous meetings where they did show up, they would say, hey, now you need to coordinate with somebody else at the FAA, and it kept going like that. And so we scheduled one last meeting with TxDOT Aviation and with FAA, and we sought to verify from them that there would be no continued federal obligations based upon the documents that we provided to them, that they also had no objection to a lease with the county, and that also that the BRA would not be seen as a financial security. As I said, the FAA didn't attend that meeting. Our legal folks contacted the FAA and spoke to them on the phone. And although I guess tangentially they kind of accepted that, but we said, okay, well, we're going to follow up in writing. And so that's what this is here. This is the actual letter that we sent to them. And we followed up in writing, and they said that they might be able to respond in writing. So we were kind of holding our breath, I guess, if you will. And over here on the right was the email response that they responded to our letter. So it was a calculated response. They had no objection to the transfer to the county, but they specifically left out certain terms. We mentioned the transfer of management, operations, maintenance, regulatory authority, but the only term that they called out was transfer of management. And then they asserted down here in the last paragraph that there was a continued federal obligation under the Civil Rights Act. And so we got that email and we're like, okay, we're nowhere closer to reaching a resolution. So I responded back to the FAA and basically addressed those issues again and essentially said, we're going to have to agree to disagree that there's federal obligations. And if and when that time arises, we'll address it at that point if the FAA ever brings it up. And then we also said that we reasserted our opinion that we're going to convey all the management duties, the regulatory duties, the security, all that to the county in our proposed draft interlocal agreement. And so at the end, I said to kind of continue to move this forward, to bring about a resolution to this. Our next steps are we're going to issue, provided the board is okay with this, we're going to coordinate with TxDOT Aviation, which is amenable to all this, a 30 to 40-year lease with the county. We're going to agree to limit the county to state funding only through TxDOT Aviation and not federal aviation. We've utilized the TxDOT Aviation ever since 1980 to fund anything from an apron that needs to be, or a runway that needs to be resurfaced, to all the lighting, et cetera. So the county, going through the TxDOT Aviation, can get the same grants that we were able to obtain to maintain the airport. And then at the end, we told that the agreement will require the county to comport with the Civil Rights Act. And the FAA seemed to be, that seemed to be one of their sticking points, but they would never address it. But they want to essentially have the county agree that they won't discriminate based upon race, color, religion, and et cetera. And that's something that the county would do anyway. So we agreed, or we stipulated to the FAA that we would include that in our agreement with the county. And that was sent, can't remember the exact date, but probably 3 or 4 weeks ago, and there's been no response from the FAA. So the next steps to try to continue to move forward is that we're looking at is to obtain I guess our recommendation is that we would move forward with the county, provide them a draft interlocal agreement. It would have those kind of high-level stipulations in there and some detailed stuff. But our recommendation would be to draft a lease agreement, coordinate with Palo Pinto County, and then execute that agreement of both parties. And so that's kind of an update. I'll take any questions that you might have. I guess there are some risk involved, but I don't think they're very, very high risk if we move forward with the county. So again, there's no action from the committee, but just want to seek some clarity on how you'd like us to move forward. Yes, sir.
Why do you think the FAA is so dragging their feet so much on this thing?
I'm not real sure. I mean, I don't know Laura Lee or if y'all, I think they're concerned about the federal obligations and they just don't want to admit that they don't have that oversight. And for whatever reason, it's.
But they would still have oversight.
I'll give you another perspective.
Okay.
I don't think they're concerned enough to pay attention. And they pay attention just long enough to answer a question or not answer a question. And I think that's what we see when we have meetings scheduled and they don't show up at our meetings. So in the big scheme of the FAA and all the stuff they have going on in Texas, they don't give us the attention that we need here. And that's kind of what we're saying. We've got enough from them in writing that we feel comfortable moving forward, that we can do the deal that we want to do and still keep them appeased and at bay and that work. That would be my response.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
Of us doing this, why we're supporting it. So we are currently like losing money.
Yes, sir.
And this would, by transferring the ownership, then we'd be in a better financial position. We wouldn't be unhappy with how that property is used over that lease term.
Right.
It wouldn't affect us in any other way, and it's just the best utilization of that property, because that's what we're here for, is property management.
Correct. And it doesn't really fit in with our core mission of the Brazos Board. And we, as you said, were able to retain the ownership of that land should conditions change or something.
Trying to figure out how I want to ask my question. So FFA is asserting some kind of authorities, and we're saying we don't agree with that authority. So what are, could be ramifications if a year later FAA says, well, y'all did this without our approval or whatever?
Yeah. It's in a legal document, so I guess I'll let.
Okay.
So, is this on? Okay, so the issue that we had initially with FAA when we had our first meeting, they said, y'all took a loan from us, we believe you did, and so we think based on those documents, you're obligated. And I said, okay, can you provide us those documents? Because these were from transactions years and years ago. They said, gosh, we don't have those documents, but why don't you guys go find them and show them to us? We said, okay, we'll go do our homework, which we did. We went back and we found all of the documentation from the past. And what we found was that when that airport was acquired, y'all jump in if I'm making a mistake, I don't think I am, but we didn't expend federal funds to purchase the land. They thought that we did, we didn't. And we showed them that. And we pulled those old loan documents and we highlighted to make it simple so they wouldn't have to read them because they don't have a lot of time. We showed them, hey, this says our obligations are extinguished when the debt we had, because we had some infrastructure debt that was not linked to the land, is paid off. And we showed it to them in the meeting and we're like, okay, here's the documents, here's the release, clearly done. They're like, okay, we'll take that under advisement. And we're like, all right, that's great. So we rock on and we wait and we wait and we call and we call and we can't get any responses. So finally, just at the point of frustration, I sent the letter back there that I showed you and I said, look, we've represented to you really clearly that we don't have, actually before I sent the letter, I called the gentleman here because I had a contact through a meeting we had. We had a meeting with TxDOT and FAA that got really contentious, nothing to do with BRA, but frankly, FAA and TxDOT were kind of going at each other in the meeting. After the meeting, one of their attorneys called me and said, hey, sorry about that. There's just some other issues going on between us. Well, I held on to her phone number. So when we got to the point where we couldn't get an answer, I called her and I said, hey, help me understand why we can't get a straightforward answer. You asked us for documentation. We provided it. I'd really like a response. And she had left that position, and this Andrew Tamahara, I believe it is, he took over. And so I left a message for him. He called me and I said, Andrew, here's our situation. All the BRA wants to do is we want to basically lease our interest in this airport to the county. We want to turn it over. They're going to take on liability, responsibility, management. We're just going to maintain that underlying fee simple and property because we feel as though that land is valuable and we don't want to divest ourselves of that asset. It might be, 50 or 70 years from now, maybe it's better to use for something else other than an airport, and we don't want to lose that value. He goes, I got that. That makes sense. He goes, well, I don't really see any problem. I said, great. Could you put that in writing? Oh, well. And then he was, doing that whole thing. I'm like, look, I just need some confirmation. I said, how about I do this? How about I draft our proposal, I put it in writing, I send it to you. Then maybe you could say yes or no. He said, well, I'll have to run that up the chain, but okay. So then I sent my letter to him, laying out exactly what I told him on the phone, and he came back with this sort of, well, you can do it, but we still sort of have this control and we're concerned about the Civil Rights Act. Well, no one's suggesting that anyone's going to violate the Civil Rights Act. Us, the county, anybody else. So when we do an agreement, a lease agreement with the county, we're going to embed in there that they have to conform to all provisions of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and any other requisites related to civil rights that the FAA may pass down. So we can contractually offload that obligation. But to make a long story short, what can happen to us? I don't know. Because I really, in my heart of hearts, believe, based on all the documentation that we have found and that we've reviewed, that we have complied with every obligation that we had to them. But to be honest with you, normally when someone presents a contract and says to you, look, we did this, so we're released, right? Most people will acknowledge that. We couldn't get that acknowledgement from them. So that's kind of where we are, candidly. It's not a beautiful picture, but I think that's pretty accurate.
Thank you.
Before you leave, I've got a question. Originally we were talking about an outright sale and now we're talking about a lease. About the advantages of why we would do a lease versus an outright sale and the reversion. What happens?
Yes, sir.
What happens if they decide not to use this for an airport?
Yeah, a couple things. So if we do a lease, we're going to have requirements in that lease agreement that the county has to do certain things to ensure that it's maintained appropriately as an airport and so forth. If we get into this lease, there's going to be provisions if they were to default where we would be able to step in if we had to and take it back. It's going to oblige them just to use it for an airport. And at the end of the day, if it ceases to be used as an airport, then land comes back to us. We still own that underlying fee simple and we have that value in that piece of property because it's, how many acres? 77. Yeah, it's like 77 acres. It's near the water. It's a nice piece of property. So we felt like it made better sense to do that than to try to do some sort of, interlocal agreement where they're taking ownership in that property.
Or if leadership in the county changes in the years to come and they decide they need money and they wanted to sell the property, then they wouldn't have that ability to profit off our property that we sold them for an airport.
Other questions?
Something bad happens there, somebody crashes and dies, they're gonna wrap us up in any kind of lawsuit anyway, because we still own the property. So you're not, in my mind, you're not getting away from much of the liability.
If it's a big plane crash, everybody's going to get sued. I'm not going to dispute that. I think that's correct. I think what we'll have to try to do in the lease is ensure that there's, to the best we can, that there's going to be insurance coverage and so forth. And we'll have to negotiate that with the county.
Can you put in the agreement that the county hold the BRA harmless?
Oh, we will, absolutely, without question.
So how was the decision between 30 and 40-year lease? How did you come about that?
Yeah, 40 years, I believe, is the maximum that you can go in conversations with TxDOT. I think there may be a statute somewhere. Woods, help me remember, wasn't there something? It seems like there's a maximum of 40, and we're still in the throes of kind of negotiating with the county on whether it's 30 or 40. We just haven't gotten that far ahead because we wanted to, quite frankly, sit down with this group and present this and see how y'all felt about the concept.
Lorley, if they were going to borrow money from TxDOT, typically those TxDOT loans are at least 20 years. So it would also be dependent upon how they would do any financing from TxDOT.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
So who at the FAA said and how did they communicate that to us, that we have obligations to them?
Do you want to pull up the document from Tamahara? Let me show you. It's all been all the communication has been via email.
I mean, I saw the email and the materials.
That's it. That's all we can get. They haven't shown one document.
I mean, back at the start.
Right.
How did we even become aware of it?
Okay. Do you want to take that?
Well, TxDOT, when we started dealing with TxDOT Aviation and they had discussions, they said, oh, hey, by the way, we mentioned this to the FAA. And then so at our next meeting, FAA was involved, and then FAA came in and said, hey, you've got all these federal obligations. We're like, what? And as Laura Lee said, so we went and found all those documents, presented them, and, lack of participation on their part moving forward, other than this email.
And in our first meeting, I specifically asked them, because they said, well, there's just all these obligations that you have for this airport. I said, okay, well, help me out. This is a long-term relationship. Help me understand. Can you point to what those obligations stem from? Silence, crickets on the line. I'm like, could you share with us those documents? And they had nothing.
Yeah.
They said, we need you to pull the documents. So, I mean, do they have anything else? Not that I'm aware of. But we did go back. We've got pretty good record keeping. We had all of the documents from back in the day. And we were able to show very clearly where we had made all the payments on the underlying indebtedness. And that was where they even acknowledged, well, that's where the obligation came from the prior indebtedness. And the documents very clearly state, I wish I had them here, I'm sorry, very clearly stated that once that obligation was paid off, that we would be relieved of those obligations. In every meeting, they keep talking about the Civil Rights Act. And candidly, Riley and I have both been sort of scratching our head going, okay, help us understand what you mean, and you never can get a straight answer. So I don't.
It's in the grant other than they just want it to still be in play, other than they just don't want to admit that. I think they just don't want to give anything up. Possibly, and so,
Or said another way, they don't want to put anything else in writing because it's maybe not worth their time and their effort. So at some point in time, we may have to just say we're either comfortable with the FAA's position or we're not. And I think what we're saying is our staff is comfortable with the information that we've had from the FAA. And if there were something to break loose in the future, we just don't see anything of significance that would cause us any, real consternation, I guess. Fair enough?
And the only other thing I would add is back to your original question of who we were dealing with. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Laura Lee, I think the original people we were dealing with at the FAA, we were told by Andrew here that they're no longer in the positions that they were in, and it's now his, and those people aren't around anymore. It was my understanding.
One other question. So when I was reading the documents, so when we got this grant to do the improvements, then there's a certain time increment that it has to be used as an airport. So if the county changed, what was that time increment, 20 years or?
If you take a grant, your obligations for 20 years to keep it open to the public.
All right, so that grant was given to us, and how long ago was it?
There's about 4 years left on that, on one of those.
Okay, so we got a few years left. That would be our only other obligation, that.
Yes.
Okay, I just want to understand.
But that's the state, right?
That's
Yes,
And
we don't think we have any obligation to the FAA at all, Director Lloyd.
Right.
And the state's on board. I mean, we're not.
That's correct.
Right, okay.
But if the county, if we lease it to them and then they get grants, we talk about leasing it to them, and what if it's better used as something other than an airport in the future? I mean, we might have to wait out any grants that they receive.
Yeah, we would be obliged for whatever that term is. So if we did like a 30 or 40-year term with the county, we would be obliged to let them continue it in that role as an airport for that window of time, unless they breached or something like that.
Well, but even if we lease it to them tomorrow, they get a grant next year, and then they stop operating the airport, and so we take management back over, we would still have to wait out any obligation that they have with the state from a grant that they've received. Is that correct?
We would likely try to encumber them to pay off that debt if they breach. Now,
And I kind of doubt that the grant would extend past the rights that the county has.
wouldn't.
Well, I know, but I'm just saying, what if they take a grant in year 35?
Yeah, I mean, I hear what you're saying, but
I missed the last meeting, so maybe y'all covered some of this, but.
No. Would likely state that they can't take out a grant beyond the term of the remaining years on their agreement, and we would also anticipate having a provision. I'll just be candid, we've not finalized that. We really haven't. We're still in the process of kind of working those lease terms and negotiating those lease terms, but part of what we would do is try to pass off that if for some reason they just decide in year 4 to fink out and they just took out a loan, that they're on the hook for that, at least contractually.
Thank you.
Let's ask this question to kind of round things out. Where do we go from here? How long does it take to get this finished?
However long it takes to coordinate with the county. That's kind of what we're here today. If y'all say yes, you're willing for us to move forward, we're going to contact the county and start working on that draft agreement. And my hope would be, what's March, April, May, I guess the May timeframe, may bring this forward to the Board of Directors in May for approval. It's all dependent upon, the county back and forth. But that, I don't foresee that being an issue.
You're looking for either a yes or a no from this committee?
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be formal, I guess, because I don't have a resolution, but just kind of a head nod. Yeah, are y'all comfortable with us moving forward?
Go.
All right, thank you, sir. Anything else?
Mike. The agenda's report and possible discussion on the B Mountain properties. Update by Sandra Milton, the property land administrator. Welcome to this group, Ms. Milton.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman and committee members. I'm Sandra Melton. I'm the Property and Land Administrator, and this is my first time presenting to you, so thank you. Today, I'll be presenting an update on the evaluation of the Bee Mountain properties and where we are today, and this is not going to be an action item. First, I would like to briefly revisit some of the history about Bee Mountain. As you may recall, the Bee Mountain project was a proposed reservoir to be constructed by the Brazos River Authority in Johnson, Somerville, and Bosque counties. And on December 8, 1952, the BRA and the United States Army Corps of Engineers entered into a land acquisition contract agreement where the BRA would acquire fee title to 62 tracts totaling 1,240 acres and grant the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers a flowage easement over the tracts for the operation of Lake Whitney. The contract had an original deadline for the Bee Mountain project to commence on or before July 1st, 1957, or the Corps at its option could acquire from the BRA the fee title to the 62 tracts. This land acquisition contract deadline was amended multiple times and eventually extended the date of commencement to July 1st, 1962. In December of 1964, the BRA sent a letter to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers stating the property acquisitions were completed, and in July of 1965, the last flowage easement was acquired. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers informed the BRA in September of 2019 that they were declining their option to purchase any of the tracts defined in the Bee Mountain Land Acquisition Agreement. During the land acquisition contract agreement, the BRA purchased 57 tracts totaling 1,228.75 acres. 49 of those tracts were owned in fee title totaling 1,074.35 acres, and 8 tracts were acquired flowage easements totaling 154.40 acres. Then we come to the October 1963 resolution. The Brazos River Authority Board of Directors adopted a resolution on October 14, 1963, that states the Bee Mountain project property can be reconveyed under the following conditions. If the authority has not granted a flowage easement to the United States of America for operation of Lake Whitney, it will retain a flowage easement the same in substance as the easements that have been conveyed. 2, the authority will obtain a perpetual option to repurchase the land at the same price at which the authority is selling it. 3, the price to be received by the authority will be the same as it paid when the tract was originally acquired. Since the adoption of the BRA's resolution relating to the reconveyance of Bee Mountain land, 30 tracts and a portion of 2 other tracts have been reconveyed, with the BRA returning the flowage easements and option to repurchase them. 749.579 acres in total have been reconveyed as of today, but no reconveyance has occurred since approximately the 1990s or early 2000s. Presently, the BRA owns fee title to 19 tracts totaling 324.771 acres and holds flowage easements by grant or reservation to 903.979 acres within the Bee Mountain project. The tract sizes range from 0.680 acres up to 99.5 acres. While considering the history of the Bee Mountain properties and the complexities that surround them, there are additional obstacles that we must consider before determining the best outcome of value for these associated properties. Currently, we do have one inquiry regarding the reconveyance of Tract 20, and this tract consists of 99.5 acres. Originally, Tract 20 was heading towards condemnation, but before a suit was ever filed, the owners reached an agreement to sell to the BRA. Since then, there's been brought forth some correspondence from the BRA dating back all the way to the 1950s that considers a buyback clause, but no such clause was mentioned in the deed. In 2002, the BRA passed a resolution that superseded all previous resolutions to clean up past resolutions that were dated back many years. This 2002 resolution has the potential to remove that mechanism to reconvey the properties as contemplated in the October 14, 1963 resolution. Also, there's an Article 3, Section 52 in the Texas Constitution that limits the BRA's ability to allow the property to be sold at the original price. So that brings us up to our current status with the B Mountain properties, which is that there's currently one inquiry regarding the 99.5 acre tract. It's known as Tract 20. And also BRA is exploring all options to consider for the BRA properties because we do have 19 other tracts. We are currently evaluating these properties to BRA's mission and to determine their best use. In August of 2022, the BRA performed a current market analysis on the largest tract, which is the 99.5 acre Tract 20. But the analysis is still under review. We provided initial briefing to the Property Management Committee back in September 2022, but since that point, further evaluations and considerations have been contemplated for all of the B Mountain properties. In January 2023, our Environmental Services Department began performing an environmental study on the tracts to determine if there are any environmental significances to the tracts. Depending on this environmental study and the market analysis review, the BRA will determine the best use for the remaining B Mountain properties. This could include retaining ownership of the properties, consider conservation efforts, or sell tracts pending Board of Directors approval. Once the evaluation process is complete, BRA will brief the Property Management Committee and the Board of Directors on findings and best recommendation forward. This concludes my presentation. Are there any questions?
How long do you anticipate looking at this tract of land before you figure out what's going to happen?
That timeline has not been determined. I do know that the environmental studies are still ongoing.
We will put together a timeline for both the tracks in question and the whole process and get something to you soon so that you'll have an expectation of our timeline. It's a good question.
Is this in the area where the Brazos water studies are?
So that is one of the reasons that we dove in to see, if we decide to do things with these properties, once we decide to divest of a property, if we did, then it could change the course of what we may have needed to do with the property.
Right.
So that's exactly what we're doing.
Questions? Don't see any other questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next item on the agenda is a report and possible discussion on the property requests by Sandra Milton, Property Land Administrator.
Good afternoon, Chair, members of the committee. I'm going to let Sandra off on the hook on this one, and I'm going to present on her behalf. So basically what we're looking at doing here, I just wanted to give you a feel, not necessarily am I looking for any feedback. This is just more for informational purposes on different property we request on, it seems like here lately on a regular basis internally, and kind of how we're proposing to move forward with these property requests. Of course, no action today, just more for informational purposes. All right, so right now we have, this slide shows 6 property inquiries around, and all of them today are around Possum Kingdom Reservoir. And actually there's a total of 8 property inquiries out there. 2 more came in between when we finalized these slides last week and today. So there's 2 more that I'll touch on at the end of at the end of this presentation. So I'm going to briefly walk through them. I'm not going to give a whole lot of detail. We could spend a lot of time talking about all the complexity surrounding properties, but just to give you a feel for what's out there. All these, you'll see the maps in here. You'll see the sections of property highlighted that there's been inquiries on. All this information came from the property management database that we recently implemented, I'd say here over the last year. So all the property information maps, all that's been developed out of that database. So the first property inquiry is out on the peninsula towards Sandy Beach, and I'd say majority of our property requests come in from adjacent property owners. Some of them are just cold calls on different properties surrounding that area. This one is for a 6.5 acre tract there that you can see. I believe in the past, prior to some of the divestiture and reduction of responsibilities out there, we used to own the road and some other things. So there's some existing easements and things like that in place, but that road's been handed over to the county now. Here's another one. This one's a little further down. If you look, that previous property request we talked about was right there. This one, again, adjacent to an adjacent property owner inquired about it. Sandy Beach is located down here at the end of the peninsula there on PK, and this is a 1.5 acre tract with no development on that has been inquired about.
Go back a slide, Blake, please. I just want to point out that this map is a real aerial photo loaded in a GIS program that is accurate to the number of the roads, the lots, but I just want to point out the number of docks that you just see on these two small maps, and the fact that we have almost somewhere between 1,500 and 1,600 docks that are just on this lake alone.
Mm-hmm. I think one other thing to point out based off that, this database, of course, it doesn't provide us, I guess, or it doesn't provide us survey information or that accurate of a position. This is just kind of more provides us an efficiency standpoint to where we can click on properties and get information quickly. And
is it just dark trees?
This is trees. So what we did, when you click on that property, it'll kind of gray out the surrounding property. So that's kind of what you're seeing. That one. The third one is in the Hog Bend area on the south side of the reservoir. For those familiar with it, this is what we call Broadway here. This is just what wasn't necessarily on any particular tract. It was just more of a call of, hey, do you have any property that you'd be willing to get rid of in the Hog Bend area? And of course, all we're doing right now is taking these properties and listing them, and I'll get to that point here in just a minute. But, this was just kind of a cold call, and that tract there I think is 249 acres. This is Set Ranch area, and you can see kind of highlighted our property located in that area. This one here, actually just across the reservoir, this is Bone Bend over here. This property is, I'm sorry, that's the next one, forgive me. This one here is located adjacent to a property owner in the ranch. Whenever we built PK, we were under FERC regulation. They had some requirements for setbacks on properties and different things related to owning and operating that reservoir under FERC regulation. So this is what is considered setback property. This was all kind of worked into the ranch agreement, and now it's considered public use property, but it's basically the adjacent property owner inquiring about that property that backs up to the water there. And, that's I'd say a pretty steep cliff. I'd say 100, 150 foot at that point, straight drop. Yeah, so access would not be, very easy in that area. It's, basically, it would be very difficult to get down to the water. This one is in that Bone Bend area, adjacent to or across the reservoir from Hog Bend. So this is, again, just an inquiry about a little piece of property there. Let's see, it's 0.9 acres. And our last one that we have in the presentation, this one's north of the airport. This is what we call Long's Camp. So just a piece of property out of that chunk of BRA retained property there. The two other property inquiries that we had, one was, or both of them were on the north end of the reservoir, the Willingham Ranch, Arrowhead area. So those are the two other additional requests that we didn't have slides prepared for this morning. So where do we go forward? These property requests continue to roll in, and they don't stop, and they seem to be coming, more frequently now. So we're trying to develop a process or a framework on how we deal with those property requests. Not necessarily are we saying that, we're looking to sell any property at all. What we're trying to determine is evaluate and determine the best use for our properties moving forward. So what we're kind of proposing here is to develop an internal process on how we'll deal with these inquiries. So whether the inquiries roll in at one of the reservoirs, whether David gets a call or others, making sure we get all those calls to the property and land administrator, and we put those property requests together. At that point, we would meet on a regular basis, thinking quarterly right now, to get together and look at those property inquiries and determine kind of which ones make sense to bring to the property management committee for potential consideration. Maybe they need further evaluation based on the complexities that surround them, whatever it may be. So bringing them to the property management committee, we would then, based on feedback received from the committee here, we would earmark properties that we would evaluate further. So looking at if we determined a market analysis, environmental considerations, conservation, could there be the potential for mitigation banking on that property? Just whatever the best use is determined. So if we got the green light at the property management committee, we would bring it back to our internal stakeholder group, and that would be representation from those major departments, operations, considering future use of the future use of the property for operational purposes, legal, environmental services, water services, Office of Security, all those different groups to make sure we've looked at it and evaluated these properties from every end that we could. Yes, sir.
Blake, let me interrupt just a minute. Because we've had some discussion on this, it seems to me that initial yardstick should be formalized with maybe 6 or 8 or 10 questions that are asked of every piece of property before you bring it to this committee. And we ought to all agree exactly on what those questions should be. And one of them is, obvious, is that piece of property going to be of use to the BRA at some point in the future? Mm-hmm. It seems to me another one is potentially if there was another person or another entity that owned it, could that ownership be adverse to the interests of the BRA? But I'm just freewheeling here, but it seems to me that we need to formalize that list of questions so that yardstick is applied to every piece of property that we look at. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. And I think that's the path where we're oh, go ahead, sorry.
Were you done? I didn't want to cut you off. Okay.
No, I'm done.
Yeah, Director Lattimore, I think you're spot on. And I think the way that you do that is put together a strategic plan for Possum Kingdom. And in that strategic plan, you identify the goals that you're trying to achieve or maintain for Possum Kingdom. And then under those goals are those questions that you're talking about. How does this property benefit the BRA? How would it be adverse if other folks owned it? And then whatever those questions or matrix are. And on every step of the way in developing those goals, I think that is the role of this committee. And then developing and accepting those questions is a role of this committee. And then that is what provides the staff the direction to even determine whether we're bringing properties to this committee or not. Because my notes from Blake's presentation are to make sure that the committee and the public that may be watching this understand something. First of all, our properties aren't for sale. We're not going through this process because we think we have properties that we just want to get rid of. We also don't want to turn a blind eye to folks that have interest in some of our properties, i.e. the walkers that are here with the B Mountain properties. And there are maybe low-hanging fruit that we want to evaluate as the process goes. But our properties aren't for sale right now. Second of all, just because folks, I want this to be clear too, just because we're getting these inquiries in for this property, we're not obligated to do anything. So once we get those goals and those matrix identified and this committee approves those, then there will be times that people will call and say, hey, we're interested in those acres. And we'll just say, hey, you know, based on these matrices, this property's not even for consideration right now. So I think what you're saying is what we see as the path forward for identifying how to protect our asset at Possum Kingdom. Then we do the same at Granbury. Then we ultimately even do the same for Allen's Creek when it's time to understand what extra properties we may own down there.
Well, and I would invite I would invite all the members of the committee. I mean, everybody's got different expertise. I would invite you to, you know, throw in your questions too on what ought to be asked. Go ahead.
So, my question, initially I understood that Blake said that maybe his team would put together questions, but then I hear from you that you're suggesting that maybe the properties committee create the questions. So is it going to be a little of both and then combine together? Or?
Well, presiding officer, what I think our recommendation would be is let us put together those drafts and bring them to you for your consideration and your change. I think we're saying the same thing.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, so a lot of these, those questions, different things, a lot of them can be, you know, you could make the argument that that's more of a policy-driven stance on where we're at as far as is stewardship really important, is conservation important. So yeah, we'd like to put together some ideas, and maybe not all of them will be used, but just, hey, here's some starting point and see if we can determine kind of what that evaluation criteria is.
And I really think between our staff and your expertise, I think that can all be done in-house.
The main reason why this committee was formed
Right.
is so that way we could start evaluating these inquiries that have come through. And it seems like more and more now, whereas I think it used to be onesies and twosies, but now it seems like there's more people living on the lake and obviously more inquiries, so.
Director Taylor?
Well, I think selecting the criteria makes all the sense in the world. But this is, if I understand this right, this will be about a property by property basis. It wouldn't be a categorical across the lake. This is our criteria across the lake. It'd be each area, depending on where it was, and each one would have to be individually selected on if we're going to sell it or not sell it, correct?
That's correct. Yeah, I think, I think the overarching goals of a strategic plan and then the matrix, the questions that you have to ask are across the board. But I also think that, I think that's right. But I think when you start looking at some of the individual properties, we'll even have some properties we can't give away. And those are, real small slivers of land that run adjacent to a road that nobody's going to want, or, you can't build on, you can't develop.
Other than the adjoining neighbor.
That's right. But and Director Ford, to your comment, even once we develop these criteria, if we were to have a piece of property that were somebody inquired about and we brought it to the board and said, hey, based on these boxes, we don't think this is a piece of property that we want, then you can ask further questions and we can figure out, again, based on your preference or change of the times or new regulations or something like that, whether we were going to sell it or not. Just because we developed this plan of how we're going to do business doesn't obligate us to sell this property.
And I think some of those, it could be where the property sits in relation to critical infrastructure. Maybe that might be a valuation criteria that we would use for one, but maybe not necessarily considered on wherever. If you just took, for example, the west side of the lake or something like that. So it's going to vary a little bit, but making sure we have those main criteria factors for each one. Another example would be easements, encumbrances, things like that. Those would have to be considered for some, but not necessarily for others.
We have the strategic plan for Possum Kingdom?
No, that's what we have, that's what we're gonna
yeah.
develop.
All right.
Thought you were trying.
Director Lloyd,
Director Lloyd.
On that list, when we eventually talk about this, just to add in for something for y'all to discuss, you know, I think in the database, we've got some check the box if we own the minerals or not. And so if we're going to convey those, what kind of control we're going to reserve over that, this close to the lake especially, so.
Yes, sir. So I think where I'd like to go moving forward is I'd like to get that brainstorming think tank together internally and us start developing that evaluation criteria, a scoring matrix. We'll see kind of what comes out of there, but ultimately bring it back to this property management committee for consideration, looking at that evaluation criteria, understanding the process and how those requests will flow through the organization, and you know how we'll look at those and consider those moving forward.
just so everybody on the committee understands, when we had our initial discussion on this, Blake and I talked about a two-step process. The first step would be an initial evaluation where they would come to this committee and give us their initial analysis before they've invested a whole bunch of staff time doing a detailed analysis. In other words, they'd come to us and say, look for that head nod, yes or no, before they go out and invest a whole lot of staff. And then if we say, yes, it looks like a potential deal, then they'll go do all the homework they need to do. So we're going to get a first look at a kind of a skeletal idea, and then we'd come back and examine it after they've gathered all the details. And the purpose in doing that was so they didn't waste, I don't mean waste, so they didn't spend a whole bunch of staff time on a project that we ultimately said, no, we don't think that's something we want to entertain. Does that make sense?
At that initial stage, though, we would need to know like the material term, like the big deal points, I think.
Yeah.
Right? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'd envision the way we bring up that piece of property and we talk about all the property information, mineral rights, any encumbrances, easements, anything that pertaining to that property, kind of give you an overview and solicit feedback from the committee on further direction on what we'd like to do there. It is a time-intensive process when it comes down to evaluating these. So yeah, I think that would be good.
Questions on this topic? Anything else on the agenda? I'd entertain a motion to adjourn. Director Savage makes a motion. Is there a second? Director Fernandez makes the second. All in favor? Is adjourned at 1:53. Thank you very much.